I'm Sarah Kensier, the author of the bestsellers The View from Flyover Country and Hiding in Plain Sight, and of the upcoming book They Knew, out in 2022.
I'm Andrea Chalupa, a journalist and filmmaker, and the writer and producer of the journalistic thriller Mr. Jones, about Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine.
And this is Gaslit Nation, a podcast covering corruption in the United States and rising autocracy around the world.
We are excited to introduce you to the winners of the Gaslit Nation 2020 Save Democracy Challenge. We called on our listeners to join us in doing whatever we could, wherever we were, to stay engaged and help get out the vote in the 2020 election. We made calls, we organized, we helped support each other through a hellish year. And guess what? We're going to do it all again in 2022 for the midterms, because we must hold the line. We have no choice. This next big election and the one after it are make it or break it elections for our democracy. The outcome of the midterms less than 1 year from now will help determine whether we'll have a free and fair election in 2024 or yet another coup. Republicans are gearing up for that coup, so we must stop them as we always do by staying engaged, refusing to abandon each other, and do what we can, where we can, to help get out the vote. You can start now by checking out the Gaslit Nation Action Guide on gaslitnationpod.com to join communities and or donate to help protect our democracy. There's plenty of organizations there that need your support. Every little bit helps, and we need you. So without further ado, here are the winners of the Gaslit Nation 2020 Save Democracy Challenge, chosen at random from all the entries we received across the country of people tweeting at us about the ways they were working to help save our democracy. You can be on this show if you join us next year. And keep in mind, when you listen to this conversation, we recorded it about a decade ago at the start of earlier on in 2021. So just keep that in mind. And this was all of us getting together to process surviving 2020 and the hellscape that it was.
Today, we are with a group of Gaslit Nation listeners coming together to process the hell that we all lived through in 2020 and then the big Georgia race. During the big year that was 2020, congratulations to all if you hung in there and fought the good fight in 2020 and the Georgia elections, the 2 Senate races, and getting out the vote and staying engaged. You helped save the world from Trump tyranny, and that matters a lot. So congratulations to you. Gaslit Nation was founded in order to create a community to help us all stay engaged in the big 2018 midterm elections. And we are going to, of course, keep that energy going because we have no choice. We must fight for our lives right now. Things are just getting worse. The big Trump machine has broken off into a countless army of little Trumps who are learning from their mistakes and improving in their mission to dismantle our democracy and bring authoritarian rule in America, because money, 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 money. It just comes down to greed and money at the cost of countless innocent lives. And as we all know, with the 2022 election coming up, it's just around the corner. If you work in organizing, everyone needs to be fighting for the 2022 midterms now. Invest even small amounts into races, organizing groups like Verified Action now, because that money needs to start coming in now to help hire people to fight the good fight as soon as possible, because we have a lot stacked up against us in 2022, including a very active effort to suppress the vote. So the nightmare scenario is that Republicans take back Congress in 2022. So then if a Democrat wins in 2024, they're going to refuse to certify the election results for the presidential election in 2024. The big lie has taken over the Republican Party. You see that with what happened to Liz Cheney getting replaced by a Trump lackey who's willing to push the mythology of the big lie. So the stakes have never been higher. And in fact, the situation is getting worse. So looking back so we can look forward, we have some wonderful folks on the show who committed to staying engaged to fight for their democracy. We're going to go down the list of our wonderful guests for today, starting with Sarah Mae Steward of White Lake, Michigan. Welcome to Gaslit Nation, Sarah.
So I live in White Lake, Michigan, in Michigan's 44th district. That means I have Michigan Representative Matthew Maddock as my rep, and also Jim Runstead as my senator. It is really rough. In 2020, I ran for White Lake Township trustee in a township that has not had a Democrat sitting on the board in over 40 years. I was able to pull in a lot of Trump supporters and Republican supporters, but not enough due to COVID. So I lost, but I did pretty well, and I'm planning on running for something again.
That's awesome.
Fantastic. Great. We'll talk more about that. All right. And next up, we have Daniel of Las Vegas, Nevada. Welcome to Gaslit Nation.
Hi, thanks for having me. Last year, as with many people, it was like the most I've ever been involved politically. I was listening to a lot of podcasts. I was able to work from home. My family is very conservative, and they're all Trump supporters, so that kind of lit my fire a little bit to get involved and take action. I enjoyed text banking the most, but I also try to make little infographics for my friends and family that ask questions on certain topics. So that's kind of what I did last year.
And now we're up next is Jeff Quiggle of Plano, Texas.
Hey, y'all. Thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here with both of you. Been a huge fan since the very beginning. My, this past year, obviously we were hugely active. I live in Collin County, which is one of the most hotly contested counties really in the country. We actually had a lot of attention from national, even international press last year coming into the November election. And, we really moved the needle quite a lot. Hillary Clinton lost Collin County to Trump by 55% to 38%. We added 100,000 votes in November. Biden got over 230,000 votes. Prior to that, Clinton had 139,000 in 2016. Unfortunately, it wasn't quite enough, but it closed the gap from 51, down to 51 to 46%. So pretty good results, not quite what we wanted. We just keep working on it. For the runoffs, the Georgia runoff, I actually was working more with Common Defense, which is a progressive veterans organization. We sent out collectively over 400,000 texts and phone calls for the runoff. We think that moved the needle by about 12,000 votes in the election, which obviously in something that close was a critical factor in taking back those two seats and taking back the Senate.
Great. Next up, we have Mark Zakarta of Owasso, Michigan. Welcome to the show.
Yes, thank you. Honored to be here. I am. I always joke I'm one of 6 farmers in the state who are Democrats. So sadly, in my profession, farmers are, vast majority are conservative and vote Republican, but I've been a Democrat for a long time. And I was a teacher for a while in Virginia. Then I moved back home and worked on the farm with my dad. After the 2016 election, my wife and I looked at each other and we're like, we got to do something more here and become more active in politics. We got active in the local Democratic Party. So we're in Shiawassee County, which is in mid-Michigan, just north and east a little bit of Lansing. And it's very rural, very red, of course, been gerrymandered into, strong Republican seat. We're Michigan's 4th district. We have empty suit John Molinar and as the U.S. representative in Congress, and a far right state senator, Tom Barrett. Sarah may know of that name, being a Michigan person. Just I call him MAGA Tom. He's horrible. But yeah, we fought our butts off, and I got into party leadership in 2018. Just passed out tons of signs and took in a record amount of donations. Of course, all of our local candidates lost. It felt like getting punched in the gut election morning when it wasn't called for Biden. And also I looked and saw that every one of our local candidates lost. It was just a red wave. Every Trump voter, came out from under the rock and just swept our whole county. So it was kind of devastating, but I'm actually the chair of the party now, and we're still working. And one thing that a friend of mine said, that she's big into politics and ran a local campaign, and she talked about how we moved the needle a little bit for Biden. And even though Trump won our county bigly, as he might say, we were still a lot of Democratic votes, which helped tip the state, which I can look back on and take some satisfaction.
Exactly. And now we have Emily Dadakis. And tell us where you are, Emily.
Hey, I live in Belfast in Northern Ireland, but I grew up in Georgia 6th District. So this was an interesting election to watch. It was, most people kind of where I live don't know much about Georgia. And, I was able to, people are like, where'd you grow up in Georgia? And I'm like, name any two counties that you know from watching CNN for the last 36 hours. And that's where I grew up.
Wow.
So I was over here in Ireland making calls, mostly to Georgia and texts. And then also what I thought was really fascinating was I did a bit of work on the ballot curing with the Georgia Democratic Party. And that was something completely new to me. Like I'd done door-to-door canvassing, different places in the country before I moved over here. But so I missed that being on the ground in person kind of connection, which I think was kind of hard for people to get, even if they were on the right continent. But I just learned a lot about the nitty-gritty stuff that goes into making every single election tick, which is quite fascinating.
So I'm going to start with you, Emily. Stay on Northern Ireland for a bit, because I think one of the questions we get a lot when we ask people to please stay engaged, fight for your democracy wherever you may live, Americans abroad go, well, how can I make phone calls? How can I send texts? So could you give advice for people living abroad, how they can stay active in politics in the U.S.?
Yeah, definitely. Like I've lived here for 15 years, but I'm not a citizen, so I can't vote here. I'm involved in politics here to some extent, but I think, I still send my absentee ballots home. So that's one of the ways I've always stayed engaged. I'm actually a DC voter, so love to see some statehood. It's on my mind too. But honestly, Democrats abroad is really helpful. I'm DC statehood party registered, but still I keep in touch with them, and I've kept in touch with like the consulate and things like that in terms of events and stuff to keep connected. Honestly, it's staying up late. You have to be willing to stay up late is the main reason, or the main way that you can stay involved. So I was able to make calls using like Google Voice and, online dial-up. The software that they were using for the Democratic Party I was able to use that. So it was just a matter of making calls until, 1 or 2 in the morning instead of 9 or 10 at night. But it's really actually quite strange because I felt like after I'd done so much calling, I made like over 1,000 calls. And at the end of the election, it was like coming out of a virtual reality machine that I had been sitting in, with like, it was like taking the goggles off. And it was like, whoa, I was here all along, but my head was really really embedded back home. So it was a surreal experience. I mean, you can decide how deep a dive you want to do in terms of keeping involved, but it felt so important. I think a couple other people had said, they hadn't been involved as volunteers before, and I just couldn't not this time. It's a logistical decision, I suppose, as well.
And how did you feel as a Georgian seeing your state turn blue twice, and the second time with 2 Georgian senators, the first Jewish senator from Georgia and the first Black senator from Georgia? How did that feel? The Georgia miracle twice.
Completely unbelievable, honestly. I say unbelievable, but to be honest, it's overpowering to understand the impact that voter suppression had really indirectly, like in ways that people almost didn't recognize. Like some people I was talking to on the phone were older African-American voters who were saying like, I don't usually vote and I'm going for it this time, and just realizing how much long-term effort had gone into beating out the sort of assumption that people could make a difference and that they could be represented. I saw my own state as a red wash, yet I knew who I had grown up with. I knew that people represented all sorts of different views. I knew how purple it was, absolutely. But it was that you still had this perception that there's absolutely no chance for something like that to happen. So to see, Stacey Abrams and Fair Fight make that immense voter registration campaign, and that itself made the difference, was just telling people, giving people that, not permission, but just that, reminder that they have impact, that they represent an enormous section of the state as well. It remains purple, but it was very emotional.
Yeah, it was the power of long-term investment and the long-term fight and smart organizing. And we had such a huge euphoric high. And then the next day was the violent attempted coup on our democracy.
Yeah, that was terrifying. I was actually working on the ballot cure while I was watching the confirmation of the electoral votes. And I thought they were just taking a break, I think, as everyone did. And I walked in the kitchen, it was like making a snack and put down my spreadsheet. And I was transcribing provisional ballots so that they could call people to cure the ballots. And my boyfriend walked in and he's like, there's a bunch of people climbing into the Capitol. And I was like, really? Like literally, there were a couple of experiences, like while I was working on the ballot cure, they were literally, counting ballots from John Lewis's district, which is the 5th, I think. And then the same thing kind of happening in January. So it felt like a 3-month long siege in itself, I think, working on both of those elections.
And I think it's good for us to also share in this interview, like where we were when that moment when we learned what was happening at the Capitol, because that was a 9/11 moment. Like, we all sort of remember that moment when the towers fell. Like, what do you mean the towers are gone? They're gone. And so it's just, if you could also share that moment, because we want to keep a record of that.
And I don't know if people actually saw it the same way, if that makes sense. I'd be interested if other people who were in the States, how that felt. But I found myself being deeply affected, like, having grief-like symptoms, I would say, for weeks after, and like sort of feel like I had to justify feeling like absolute shite to people, and almost like not quite connecting myself why I was so traumatized by having seen that, because I think it was just intriguing that it was so, people were trying to rationalize it or downplay it, just to, whether it was to stay sane or to gaslight, there were different reasons for that, but I found that really, difficult to kind of articulate to people.
Yeah, without question. Sarah and I struggled with our own grief privately and publicly on the show. And the day after the Capitol attack, when everything really sunk in throughout that day, because the day itself was full of shock. It's like, what do you mean they're in Pelosi's office? And so the next day it really hits you. The horror of it hits you. And I took my daughter to the park, my toddler, like I always do. And normally my little girl is super adventurous, goes headfirst down slides. I have to chase after her, and that's my workout for the week. But the day after the Capitol attack, she was incredibly clingy. She would not leave me. 2 other parents at the park with toddlers said the same thing. Parents were talking, we're just saying the children must sense our own fear and anxiety as much as we're trying to be strong and put up a brave front. It's clear from whatever we're putting out in the world, our energy, that mom and dad don't feel safe. And it's hard to hide that when you feel like on such a fundamental level you've been violated. This is a game changer now. And unlike 9/11, obviously 9/11, the country united. And now, because of this terrorist attack, we're divided because one side committed it and one side is proud of it. And one side is incredibly guilty and seeing a lot of their friends, families, loved ones, political leaders arrested. So it's this really horrific time that we're still living in of massive gaslighting. Sarah, do you want to comment on that? Because you're kind of...
Yeah. I mean, I just briefly, as everybody who listens to this show knows, we knew that the Capitol attack was coming in advance. That's why we announced a special about it in advance, because the perpetrators, they told us that. And so I expected this. I was horrified by it, but I was kind of watching it upstairs alone on the computer. And I didn't realize my 2 children, were 10 and 13 at the time, were watching it downstairs. And then my husband had joined them because he had seen what had happened. And they were just sitting there shell-shocked and just very, very upset. And my son, I'll never forget this, he's 10, and he looked at me and he said, Mommy, like, I know this is a historical moment, but I don't want to watch this. I want to turn this off. Can I turn this off? And I'm like, of course you can turn this off. And they were teary-eyed. And, these are kids. They're my kids. They've watched me cover all this stuff. They've watched me get threats. And I tried to protect them from that as much as possible. But, and they're St. Louis kids. They're used to life being kind of rough. They were absolutely traumatized by it. This is something I think a lot of people in the United States don't talk about, is the effect of this on children. And in that dynamic. And then the other thing, I was talking about this with my daughter actually this morning, was my fear during the inauguration that Biden or Harris or somebody else might get shot. I was very, very afraid to let my kids watch the inauguration. I kept wishing it was virtual because I was afraid it would happen again, because it was clear that we had a massive security problem. And that's a terrifying feeling for a parent to have. And it's terrifying that it's still out there. You know, they haven't done a real investigation. They haven't done hearings. They haven't held the big shots accountable. They've been going for low-hanging fruit. And so all that's lingering out there. And I think it's, you know, obviously the pandemic is the leading cause of national trauma, international trauma. But I think this unresolved tension about this threat to our capital, to our country from within, and the pride they take in making that threat is also a source of great trauma and sadness, you know, for children and parents alike.
I remember living in New York City as for an internship after 9/11, and all the New Yorkers I was befriending had to tell me where they were that day, what that experience was like. And I feel like a lot of the conversations we're having on Gaslit Nation and we'll continue to have is about the terrorist attack on January 6, 2021, because it's something we have to continue to keep processing. And the gaslighting around it is part of the ongoing abuse and the continuing threat as well. So I want to turn now to Texas, because I myself made a ton of calls for Texas, even though we had Michigan and Pennsylvania on the line as potentially being very close states in 2020. I followed Beto O'Rourke in the big dream of finally turning Texas blue, and I invested my time there. And there was a lot of talk of whether that was a smart move or not in 2020 with so many states needing our help. So I want to ask Jeff, what is the deal with Texas? When will Texas be finally blue, if ever?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you know, we asked that question ourselves over and over again. You know, I was involved with Beto's campaign in 2018 and in his brief presidential run. I actually started an organization called Veterans for Beto that supported both his Senate run and his presidential run. So I'm a huge fan of Beto. And I think Emily might have said this. It's a long-term investment to try to flip these kind of traditionally red states. And the thing that you need to understand about Texas is it's really not a red state. It's already a purple state. The city where I live, Plano, we actually voted for Beto in 2018. We voted for Biden last year. And again, because of gerrymandering districts that take these kind of suburban and urban cores and they spread those districts out into the rural areas that are far more conservative, that allows Republicans to retain a hold. And then, of course, voter suppression, like in Georgia, like in other states in the South, like in other states elsewhere, things like voter ID laws. You know, I was watching Georgia, their new law that they recently passed, you know, putting ID laws in place and getting rid of ballot drop boxes for absentee ballots. We've already had those bans in Texas for years. We passed a ID law a few years ago that's very onerous, right? You can vote with, for example, if you don't have a driver's license, which many poor people and people of color don't have, you can vote with a concealed carry permit license, but you can't vote with a student ID. You know, that's not going to work. So that turns people away. Just until recently, like even in Dallas County, which is very, very blue at this point, you had to actually go to your assigned precinct to vote, which meant that people across the street had to go somewhere entirely different than they did. So just all these sorts of arcane laws made it hard even before 2021. And now we've got a very large package of bills that is about to go to they're not out of the ledge yet, but they're about to go. That's going to further suppress voting, you know, getting rid of, like, one of the things that Harris County, which of course is the largest county in Texas, one of the things that Harris County did to try to make sure people could vote in the middle of a pandemic, right, is they set up these drive-through voting in parking garages so that people could come through. And they actually hugely expanded the vote in Harris County. They had multiple lawsuits filed against them by Republican and conservative activists to try to shut that down. They were able to continue that. But one of the laws bills that's coming out of the ledge right now is to specifically target no voting in parking garages. You know, you have to vote in a building that has 4 walls. You can't vote in a building that has a roof but no walls. And it's like, really? They're also trying to get rid of what I don't know if other states call it, but here in Texas it's called the Deputy Voter Registrar Program, where anyone that wants to go get the training can be deputized to go register voters. Well, they want to take that program away so that you would only be able to register through the Secretary of State of Texas. And then what's super interesting about that is just yesterday we learned that the current Secretary of State is going to have to resign because the Senate, the Texas Senate, which has to confirm Secretaries of State, has refused to confirm her. mainly, we think the consensus is that the 2020 election went way too smooth for these Republicans in the state legislature. They don't like it. They didn't like the fact that all these people are voting. People start to vote. Gosh, they might actually vote against Republicans, and they might go out, because Texas is actually a microcosm of Georgia, right? We're Georgia, only bigger. It's the same thing, right? Our cities are blue. Our suburbs are mostly blue. You get out in the rural areas, which is most of the state, and suddenly it gets pretty red. But that's changing, and it's just a constant investment. If y'all aren't careful in Georgia, we're just going to go out there and get Stacey Abrams and bring her here. And I think between her and Beto, we can probably get the folks registered to get out the vote and flip the state.
So what is the strategy for the way forward in Texas? Is it do we just have to wait for enough people to either move to Texas, or is it just a matter of time, just like Virginia eventually turned blue? Virginia was called very early on election night, because now it's just a given that Virginia's blue. So when do you think we're ever going to get Texas there? And what is the path? What would have to happen for Texas to become the next Virginia?
So if you listen to Beto, he'll say over and over again that Texas is not so much a red state, it's a non-voting state. And we have a problem with voter registration and voter turnout. Here in Collin County, like I said, has been a battleground for a couple of years now. We think there's probably 100,000 potential voters who are unregistered. If we can flip 60,000, if we get 60,000 people registered, that was more than enough of the 2020 margin so that we can actually start winning these elections here. So the path forward really is voter registration, which of course Beto's organization, Powered by People, is doing. We're doing it. The TDP, Texas Democratic Party, is working on that. Part of it is migration. Republicans talk a lot about business-friendly Texas. That results in companies moving here. Well, guess what? They're bringing their employees too, and not all those employees are far-right Republicans like they'd wish they were. So that's going to be part of it. But it's also, really countering the gaslighting that goes on, right? And y'all, Sarah and Andrea, this, right? Rural Texans who are overwhelmingly Republican, it's the same in Michigan, it's the same in Georgia. They vote against their interests, right? What have we seen here in Texas? We've seen, healthcare declining in the rural areas because there's not enough money. Like other states, Texas refused to accept the Medicaid expansion. So you've had hospitals closing, you had doctors leaving rural areas. There are some counties in Texas, some of the very rural counties, that might have one doctor or two doctors and no hospitals, right? So if you're out in, say, far west Texas and you need to go to a hospital because you've got COVID and you need a ventilator, it's a helicopter ride to Lubbock or to San Antonio or somewhere, because you're not going to get it where you are. So that's a huge problem. Public school, rural areas rely on public schools. They don't have access to things like private schools or charter schools. So the more Republicans chop at that, the more folks need to see, hey, you're voting against your interests. And then finally, things like infrastructure. If COVID taught us anything, it's that broadband is infrastructure. And if you don't have broadband, you had a hard time getting connected to school. You had a hard time getting connected into the broader entrepreneurship. So getting that infrastructure, including broadband internet, out into those rural areas is something that we can focus on. These are Democratic priorities. These are not Republican priorities. That's what we have to do. So kind of three things, right? Voter registration, voter education, and getting people out to the vote.
Wow. Okay. And so you think there will be a tipping point where you can come to power in Texas, and by coming to power, you can finally challenge and take on the gerrymandering that's been holding your state hostage?
Well, and that's, of course, the big problem that we're facing right now is the Republicans control the ledge. They're the ones that are going to draw the lines later this year when the census data is available. I think they're going to have to call a special session in like August or September to do the redistricting. We're hoping that the For the People Act comes up and we get some protection at the federal level so that they cannot draw obviously gerrymandered districts that are going to favor Republicans going forward. We've had that problem here for many years, going back to the early 2000s when Tom DeLay, he was able to redraw lines kind of out of cycle and really kind of locked in Republican control of the ledge since then. We haven't had a Democratic ledge since I think the late 90s. So it's really been a struggle. And that's going to be a huge problem if we don't get some federal help, if they're able to go in and redraw these lines with the data that they have now. And Sarah and Andrea, I know you've talked about data and how certain companies have been able to collect that data. it's going to make it really difficult to overcome from a district by district perspective, winning the ledge and the state Senate seats that we need to flip the House.
So would you say a contributing factor to the voter suppression electoral hostage situation that Texas, a purple state, is currently in is the work of Tom DeLay?
That was the start, obviously, but the last time that redistricting happened was in 2010, and that got us the current districts that we have, which are, I mean, if you look, I can't show you this, I can't share my screen, but if you look at, just go to like Wikipedia and look at the Texas House districts, for example, it's just ridiculous. Some of these districts that are drawn, I mean, gerrymandering is almost, I mean, you look at the districts, like, for example, Dan Crenshaw, who's the fun guy down in the Houston area. You know, he's got this district that like goes all the way around Houston, which is a very blue area, but it's been drawn specifically to get those red areas out in the burbs. There's districts in Central Texas that run from San Antonio all the way almost to Dallas because they're pulling in those specific areas that are going to deliver that Republican district. Districts that start in Dallas and go all the way to the East Texas border with Louisiana, trying to, again, bring in those rural areas that are going to counteract those pesky people of color in Dallas that are going to vote for Democrats.
Yeah, so we're up against decades of work that Republicans have done to get us here. And so it's not going to happen overnight. We're not going to undo gerrymandering and voter suppression laws. That's why it's so important to have all of you together here with us and keep having these conversations and keep getting out the vote, because we have to stay engaged election cycle after election cycle. Midterm elections are just as important as presidential elections. And we have no choice but to fight like hell and run for office. So Jeff, you started your own, I want to move on to other folks, but I have one more question for you. You started your own group, the Vets group. Could you talk a bit about what ignited you to become active? And what advice do you have for people to start your own organizations and build your own thing?
When Mark was talking about his origin story, I mean, it was almost exactly the same thing. I really was never an activist prior to 2016. And it was the same thing. You know, my wife and I woke up that morning after the election and we just felt sick. So we looked at each other and said, all right, let's get to work. And we just kind of went from there and just got more involved. The first thing I ever did is I went to the protest at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport when the Muslim ban was put into place. You know, I was out there with a few, I don't know, I can't remember how many hundreds of people were there, but supporting the folks who were trying to get out of the airport. You know, from there, I ended up getting involved with Beto. I went to the Democratic State Convention. That's where I met some folks that encouraged me to get involved with his campaign. Figured out what we could do. We started that group. One of the things that I think it's important to understand, I don't know if there's other veterans on this call, there's this myth that veterans are all conservatives and veterans are all Trump supporters, and that's absolutely not true. Certainly there are plenty of folks who are veterans and in the military who are conservative, but there are far more than you might think who are not and who are supporting of progressive causes. You know, the group that I'm involved with as well, Common Defense, we've got thousands of folks on our email list. We have hundreds of core activists who are doing everything from lobbying Congress for change. We had a big part in the end of the forever wars. We're very thankful to President Biden that he's finally decided to get us out of Afghanistan. You know, you might have seen some of the things that we did during the impeachment cycle, not this last one, the first one. You might have seen the banner that some of my friends in Common Defense unfurled behind home plate at the World Series in 2019.
Wow. What did the banner say?
It said impeach Trump.
Not once, but twice. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was the first time. We had no idea that it was going to take two, and we still couldn't get the guy out. But, you know, as far as getting started, I mean, you just have to get started. And the thing that folks don't realize until they actually start talking to people is that there's more like them, you know, especially in red states, whether it's Texas or Georgia. You know, I remember the first few times I started knocking on doors for Beto, you know, people would come to the door and they'd say, oh, yeah, you know, I like Beto a lot, but, you know, don't tell my neighbors. And, you know, because they're all Republicans. It's like, well, you know what? I just talked to your next door neighbor and he just asked me to bring him a Beto yard sign. So, you know, the more you get out, the more you'll find people that are like you. And that's really what it's all about, is finding your voice and wanting to make an impact, whether it's local, you know, in your county, in your city. You know, Sarah running for office, that's awesome. You know, Emily out in Ireland actually helping out. everything that you can do is helpful. And that's just, it's important just to find that passion, find that mission and go do it.
Fantastic. Now let's talk to Sarah about running for office. That's Sarah Mae Steward of Michigan. Tell us about your experience. Give us a sense of what you're up against, where you live, and what you learned from putting yourself out there, which is a big, exciting thing to do.
In 2016, when I went to vote, I noticed that there were no Democratic precinct delegates, on my ballot. And so I called the election specialist and she said, oh, well, you can run it as a write-in. You just have to have 2 votes. So I had her come fill out the paperwork with me. She showed up at my precinct and we filled out the paperwork and I just posted on Facebook, like, anyone who hasn't voted yet. And if you're in my precinct, please consider voting for me. And I ended up being precinct. I think I got like 6 votes or something. I made sure my husband waited until I got back to go vote. Around here, the party is very focused on top level. So it was really hard for me to even figure out what I'm supposed to do as a precinct delegate. Since then, we've formed there's a whole group called the Oakland County Precinct Delegates that trains people and takes in, any input that they have and tells them what to do. Because for me, I had to show up to an indivisible group, find a candidate, latch myself onto them and be like, please tell me what you need me to do. I'm supposed to be knocking doors. I don't know what to do. Once the pandemic hit, I'm a bartender. And of course I was laid off and I got involved in One Fair Wage. And also the Centers for American Progress contacted me to do like a short little video. It was all over Facebook and it was very embarrassing. And then it was just like, well, I can't keep complaining about White Lake being only Republican ran and sitting in these meetings and getting so mad at these people. If who else is going to run? If I don't step up and just like show people that you can do it, then, nobody's going to do it. It feels very scary here. It is extremely, extremely Republican here. Like the fuck your feelings signs, the no more bullshit signs, the, just Trump everywhere. The trolls have taken over local Facebook groups around here. So if you have like here we have White Lake Township happenings and the trolls have absolutely taken it over. You can't post anything without being threatened or, told to suck it up, liberal, whatever, you can't do anything. So everyone feels like they're being attacked. So I ended up running and I ended up getting so many people contacting me, just being like, I thought I was the only one. What can I do to help? And for me, I did my whole campaign by myself. There wasn't a whole lot of support for the person who was running against Matt Maddock. So when people came to me, I'd just send them to her. Like, please donate to her. I have, I only need to buy like 100 yard signs or something. Like, it's not a big deal. And I sent them over to her, but it was really interesting to have so many people just wanting to help, asking what they could do to join in. And then I think the thing that might have affected my campaign is that then the Biden campaign contacted me and I did an ad for him and it aired during 60 Minutes and during the NFL playoffs or something. And I immediately had death threats and people coming after me for being, it said my name at the bottom, Sarah from White Lake. But I mean, we just put up security cameras and some Democrats do own guns.
Wow. That is an incredible story. So thank you, first of all, for doing all of that and taking such great personal risk. And I know, I just can't even imagine how threatening that environment must be to live and work in and to put yourself out there. And especially in a state like Michigan, where there was a plot by a white terrorist militia to kidnap your governor, Gretchen Whitmer, and execute her. And clearly they're going to do horrible stuff to her. And that was foiled. But that was a big focus of political violence, where you had Trump using his Twitter account as a weapon against her, putting her life in danger, putting all his attention on her, like really putting a target on her head. And that trickles down clearly. Like, we talk on the show how the only trickle down the Republicans have actually succeeded with is the trickle down of their hate. And Trump is a great example of that. And Michigan was a big arena for their political violence. And you were operating in the thick of that. My God. So thank you so much.
This area is a really big home base for that because, so Matt Maddock, he's the founder of the Conservative Coalition. He's the original founder of the Michigan Tea Party. His wife is the co-chair for the Michigan GOP. I mean, she has sent her Proud Boy daughter's fiance into my bar to threaten me. I mean, they're not great people. They're actually like really horrid people. They're just, the Maddocks are very dangerous in this area.
Yeah, they're stormtroopers. There's a whole history of people like them, and they have a lot of use for the wannabe autocrats for sure. So for people listening abroad who just have basic questions, like what is the deal with them? Like what do they want? What do you think that they want?
I think they're really angry. I mean, of course, part of it is racism. Part of it is misogyny and the patriarchy and not liking things to change. And just, these people are not rich. I don't know why they think they're going to be taxed so hard. They just, I don't really completely understand it, but I do know that they're fueled by anger. Like if you can get them worked up about something, they'll jump on whatever bandwagon and whoever is helping them feel that rage and pointing them in the direction to take it out. But I mean, I had a lot of success in just listening. You know, I'm friends with a lot of my regulars that were Trump supporters. And a lot of times it just took them seeing that, like, I actually cared about them and their family, you know, like celebrating their birthday with them or finding out it's their wife's birthday and like bringing her a coffee cup with candy in it or something. They'd be like, oh, but you're one of the good Democrats. Like, we're all like this. We're just human. It just seems like they just wanted to be angry all the time about everything. I had a guy the day that it was announced that Biden won walking around the bar and grabbing women's genitals.
Oh, wow.
And when I tried to throw him out, he was like, I didn't do anything. I'm like, there's 6 girls standing behind you that just said that you grabbed them. And he went outside the bar and told any person that walked in, don't go in there. It's a Democrat bar. Like, it's not just Democrats that are against you grabbing genitals.
The Democrats are going to raise your taxes and not let you grab women.
Willy-nilly.
Yep, that's what it comes down to. How are you handling all this? Like, how are you navigating it? Like, how are you keeping yourself in the fight, given everything that you're up against, and what's next for you?
So I'm kind of used to living in high stress panic mode. My daughter's 17 and has schizencephaly, cerebral palsy, and hydrocephalus. So she uses a power wheelchair. And for the first 8 years of her life, everything was very touch and go. So I'm pretty used to just living, like dealing with the thing that's happening at that moment. And then, so like thinking ahead's not something I do a lot. It's just like, what do I need to do right now? And what's ahead for me? So we're redistricting. In Michigan, we're lucky enough to have voted for Prop 2 and 3 in 2018. But I mean, our legislature is trying to gut all of that right now. Anyways, everything that we did. But with redistricting, if I'm still in Matt Maddock's district, I'm running against him. He's going down, him and his wife both. But if I'm not, then I might run for county commission or something. But in this district, you can't put people who are like super hoity-toity Democrats thinking they're better than everyone else. You need a sassy, swearing bartender. So I think that I'll be going up against him.
Good for you. And what advice do you have for people running in very red districts?
When I ran for township trustee, everyone kept telling me it was impossible and why are you doing it? And first of all, I really like canvassing. You get to like pop in a podcast and just go walk out in nature and get your exercise in and meet your neighbors. So, I mean, that was something that I looked forward to doing, and I did it every day until I went to work. So I would get my daughter up and get her ready. And then if my husband was home, he's a firefighter. So if he was home, it was like, see ya, I'm gone. And I'd just be walking for like 9 hours a day. But I just never told myself it wasn't possible. It's not impossible. And even just like one more vote is like proving them wrong. Just because you don't win, I mean, that's not the biggest deal. It's actually getting out there and talking to people and getting them to understand that, like, you're not against them. You want to make your community better. And I'm also a firm believer in community service and bringing other people into together. You need to have a community. You need to be talking to people in your community, whether they agree with you or not, because otherwise you forget their humanity, and it's really hard.
Well, thank you so much for that, and keep us posted on all your work. I'm sure we'll hear more from you.
Real quick, let me jump in. Sarah, if
Please.
you do run, I want you to reach out to Common Defense. We supported several candidates in Michigan last cycle. We did phone calls, we did texting. We don't support just veteran candidates, right? We support progressive candidates that are right for that race. So reach out. And I'll tell you right now, I can't make the decision, but I'll bet you we can get Common Defense to support you.
Great, I will. Thank you.
Oh, you guys, I'm getting tears in my eyes. This is really nice. So now we're up to Mark, also in Michigan, and we want to hear from you in terms of the farmers of America, and why are so many conservative, do you think, especially when things are just getting worse and worse for the American farmer, and what your experiences were like in becoming politically engaged in the work that you do?
Yeah, actually, you guys talking about where you were on January 6th, I actually was headed into my local USDA office, but I was actually streaming the news, and I heard them break in with, they just grabbed Mike Pence and Nancy Pelosi and something's going on, and realized like the magnitude of it. And then when Jeff mentioned earlier about they haven't had in Texas the legislature since the late 90s, I mean, that's, all this coincides with the rise of the right-wing media apparatus. So the same thing has happened to rural people, and it's this rural-urban divide that, in my opinion, from my perspective, being a farmer and living in a rural area, that's tearing the country apart, because Republicans have been able to weaponize that divide. Fox News, all they do is talk about how terrible the cities are. The cities are to be feared. There is no question. There's needles in the streets a lot of San Francisco, and, feces everywhere. And there's a reason they're doing that. And that is because they see how important the rural-urban divide is. So basically, they were all kind of in the joke. And then basically there was like the BS hosing down the people out in the populace, they're going to take away your guns, and they're going to make everybody get an abortion. And then eventually they turn the BS hose on themselves, to where now legislatures, like a couple of my state representatives, like my U.S. House representative, I mean, I don't doubt that they are true believers. I mean, they really think they are fighting for the good old America and to make America great again. And just like Sarah was talking about the Maddox, that was such a story around here last year when they made that Michon Maddox the co-chair of the GOP, the Michigan GOP. I mean, talk about picking a direction. I mean, it's been, the Republican Party is the Trump party, and that happened here in Michigan, just like in so many other states, unfortunately. Another irony of the USDA I want to mention too is that so many farmers, get quite a few payments from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Our crop insurance programs are tied in with the USDA. It's all subsidized.
Yes, exactly. Martin Luther King made the same point, that the farmers get socialism, when people of color, they don't. And there's a reason for that, of course. And then also, to your other point of pitting the two sides of America, rural and urban, against each other, that's how Hitler came to power. He ran on that. The real Germany was the Germany of the romanticized countryside, the farmer. That was the real Germany. And it was all of the quote unquote perverts in the cities that were a threat. So we're seeing the same patterns today. But go on, Mark.
So yeah, that's been a focus, like we're trying to do it in our rural county, is to, figure out ways to bridge that divide. We're actually about a half hour or so, less than a half hour really, from Flint, Michigan, which has been so prominent in the news due to the water crisis. And, it might as well be around the world to a number of my neighbors, because Flint is a predominantly Black city, and it's just chopped off, gerrymandered away from us. And I get the sense that many people feel really disconnected. And what would be a great thing if we could feel more connected to Flint, our proximity, our shared automotive and manufacturing history. And that's one of the things Sarah mentioned, the redistricting. So we're really excited about that our redistricting, despite the best effort of the GOP, they fought tooth and nail. But the redistricting commission is operative. They're starting to hold meetings now. That's something that we're trying to focus on, is getting progressives out to those meetings and to try to, make a positive effect on our districts. And I'm going to argue that we should be joined maybe with Flint or part of Flint. And that might even hurt a Democratic candidate, because Dan Kildee is a U.S. representative in the Flint district. His district has been packed with the urban communities of Saginaw and Flint. So all those Dems are packed in there, so we can have as many Republican districts as possible, of course. But that's one thing that I was thinking about advocating for, is trying to mix and get shared interest, shared representation in Congress.
Do you think so many American farmers are conservative because they just buy into the far-right propaganda, or they haven't had voter education? Is there not enough outreach from the Democratic Party?
I think so. I think the Democratic Party can shoulder quite a bit of blame for kind of leaving rural America out. There's only so many resources, granted. But yeah, they're insular communities. Our whole history of the racism of the country, the rural areas have stayed vast majority, white. And as of the last few decades, increasingly older. So all these people have very little outside experience. They live in a very insular bubble. And that's weaponized with the right-wing media and Fox News and all these other, AM talk radio. I'm sure Sarah also is familiar with, WJR, News Talk 760. You turn it on, so sometimes for fun, I flip over to stations like that. It takes literally 10 seconds to hear a far-right talking point. Either we're attacking unions or just all the same old, BS that comes from them about, making sure they keep their listening public scared and voting GOP. So that's what these people in rural communities, that's what they're exposed to, and they believe it. They become true believers over time. But that's what we're trying, like I say, I hope the Democratic Party going forward has a focus shift and tries to dedicate more resources to rural areas to try to illuminate to these people, as we've mentioned before, that they need to stop voting against their best interests.
And what are some issues that the American farmer is struggling with that you want the rest of America to be aware of?
The thing that I see the most often is the increase in farm size. I always think of it as like the Walmartization of farming, nonstop consolidation, just like so many other things we see around us. It seems like pretty soon the world will be like either Amazon or Walmart. And there's a similar thing with farming, where there's fewer and fewer farms, larger and larger farms. The larger farms can crowd out the small farms because of, efficiencies of scale. They can pay more, and money talks. It's the almighty dollar, just like everything else. So if you're a landowner and some huge farmer offers you $300 an acre to rent your land, and then a smaller farmer is like, well, I can only pay $150, but I'm your neighbor. Don't you like me? And who are they going to pick? Farming definitely needs support. And I've heard a lot of liberals and progressives complain about farm subsidies. And that's where, from some of my experience, I push back a little bit, because they are essential. You have to have farmers. And farming is an occupation that is unique in so many levels. And you can lose everything in a year. And with climate change, we're seeing it more and more. We're in a terrible drought in Michigan right now. I think it was supposed to rain this weekend, and I really hope it does, because we desperately need it. But due to climate change, there's more and more risk. We need crop insurance that needs to be subsidized by the government to help everybody stay in the game, because you can't let one crop failure sink 50% of the farms in a given area in a given year, just due to Mother Nature. So we have to support our farmers, and I hope the Biden administration does better to help support small and farmers, even socially underserved farmers. I just saw, maybe someone else saw this too, an article in the Times about a black farmer, and it might have been Missouri. I think it was, Sarah, in Missouri, where he woke up one morning, found out he was getting like $250,000 due to some program. And the white farmers, of course, in the area are outraged for that socialism going to not them. But yeah, rural outreach is important, and the bridging the gap is essential to moving forward, not ending up in our autocracy dystopia, which we feel like we're plummeting towards.
Right, because of the monopolization of farms and climate change, of course. And as climate change, how is that impacting your outreach to other farmers? Are you making headway there around that conversation?
I think there is. Personally, I should do more personally. I mean, we only have so much time, and we're pretty active with our local party. And I have thought many times about trying to talk one-on-one more with farmers. Of course, it's a tricky thing to breach the topic of politics and stuff, but the farming community, I remember seeing a professional farming magazine a year or so ago where the cover page was like climate change, it's here, we're feeling it now. And so farmers are, I think, starting to turn a little bit, and maybe that little bit of disconnect from the right-wing talking point will maybe help them to kind of like realize this whole voting against your own interest thing. But it's very real. We're seeing it more and more. We either are too wet, we can't do anything, you get 4 inches of rain dumped on you in 2 days, or we're bone dry for a month and a half. And like I say, farmers are seeing that acutely, and hopefully they start to realize that too, that there's one party who's interested in trying to help the climate, and there's one party that isn't. And hopefully you start supporting the party more often that does, even if it's at the local level. But that's another huge thing too, is with support and subsidies for farmers to do positive practices, environmentally sound practices. So there is a role for the government that has to be played that no other organization can do, and that no farmer would do on their own. So most farmers, the average age, last I heard, is probably like 59 years old, and they are not going to implement a sound practice to preserve their soil from erosion or runoff, or use chemicals responsibly because of the goodness of their own heart, unfortunately. So the USDA has to play a role to preserve our environment and our farmland, which is essential, by providing subsidies and incentives. I've seen that firsthand driving around where I live. People have filter strips. They're trying to prevent erosion. They're trying to implement best practices for farming due to those programs from the USDA, which is a huge benefit to every single American and even people living everywhere on the planet.
That's great. So government works, and America's farmers need government. So thank you for that. All right. So Daniel of Las Vegas, Nevada, you are up. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And tell us about your experiences in Las Vegas. Nevada was, of course, a state that was targeted by the big lie. And we were watching Nevada. So could you talk about like what your experiences were like in Nevada in 2020 and what the work you did and what's going on?
Well, I've only actually been here 3 years, so I don't know a whole lot. But from my experience, it is definitely a purple area when you kind of get out and go around and see all the people. My work, especially where I'm at in retail, is a mix of blue and red supporters. But yeah, like how everybody here is saying that my political activism didn't really kick in until like 2016. After the election result, did some protests, and then the whole George Floyd situation and the pandemic just really kind of got all involved as much as I can. My wife and I, we campaigned for Elizabeth Warren.
Yay!
Yeah, that was an experience. She did more of the work than I did, and that actually kind of motivated me more to get involved. We caucused for her out here. She canvassed all around our neighborhood. We don't have a car because we were in New York City for about 8 years. So we just walk around, but all my in-laws, they believe in the big lie. They think somehow Trump is just going to be the president again any day now. And it's really hard to deal with them. And then most of my family is on that same wavelength. My grandma, like she's someone who I grew up with and who raised me and taught me how to walk. And I'm like, how can you believe in all this stuff and support all these things? And so, yeah, that just really kind of got me more involved in trying to correct their thinking. And I did like infographics. I was constantly fact checking things, like all their memes and I don't know if you saw, but the New York Times actually ended up doing a fact check on it too. But there was like this huge list of like 123 things that the former president actually did or whatever. And I was like, there's no way this is true. And I was like looking through that, and as to be expected, most of them were lies. He didn't do most of those things. But yeah, so I was just fact checking, and due to the pandemic, I was able to end up working from home and just kind of do fact checking and text banking. And I was just kind of sitting with my fingers crossed, waiting for the results of the election day, and then the whole Georgia thing. And I was like, oh man, what's going on? And so I was like, I have to get back into text banking. And so that was kind of my experience.
And have you had any success at all with your family in the fact checking and the big lie?
Nope, none whatsoever. They think I'm crazy. My mom just doesn't want to even go there in politics. And my dad he tries to push my buttons all the time. And I just try not to go there. It's just like, I mean, I still love my family, but I don't want to, like, I try to stay positive when I talk to them and visit with them. But my in-laws is another story. They didn't raise me, so I don't really care about that.
So you and your wife are struggling with this?
Yes. My wife even more so, because she got really involved in mutual aid out here. And we were feeding the unhoused people out here. And we were also just working on trying to, I guess to put it bluntly, fight Nazis that are in our area. And she got involved in a campaign that was trying to expose those that were actually like strong supporters of All Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter. And unfortunately for her, that she ended up starting to get a lot of death threats. And we had no idea how they even got her information. And they even found out her personal phone number and our address. And so it got pretty like scary a little bit. So she signed off completely and basically kind of fizzled out with her activism just out of safety concerns. And then all of her family, more than mine, they're also way into guns. So that was also kind of a concern too. And we think maybe one of them was actually kind of giving out her information or our information. So she basically kind of stopped communicating with all of them, except her mom. So.
Wow, I'm so sorry to hear that. It's just incredible. I mean, just these stories that we're hearing of the death threats. I'm sure this is a lot more common than is being reported. Just in this small sampling of Americans here in this meeting, I'm sure a lot of people are struggling with these issues. In terms of your family, are they breathlessly refreshing the news for any day now for Trump to take over? Like, what is their level of engagement there?
I know they watch OAN now as their main thing, and Epic Times or Epoch Times, however you say that, always sharing stuff from that. My side of the family, not my in-laws, I really don't know, because to be honest, once I kind of realize they can't change their mind and they're set in their ways, I just try not to talk about politics with them anymore. I've realized just from the stuff my in-laws post, they think any day now. They have no, like, my wife will even ask my mother-in-law, like, what proof does Uncle Rod have that Trump's going to all of a sudden become president? And they don't. So it's like, how can you believe something when there's nothing to support it? It's been kind of a thing for me to wrap my head around.
So in researching this topic, whether it's QAnon or the big lie, when people get sucked into cults, it's really important not to abandon them and to stay engaged. And it sounds like you're doing that through keeping things positive and patient. So that's good.
Speaking of cults, I think that's a big part of it too, because both my in-laws and my biological family are all evangelical Christians. And that's what my wife and I grew up in. And thankfully, we then grew out of it. And we're kind of, I guess, quote unquote, able to see the light and see reality. But I think, as you guys have said, that's a big part of it too, is somehow that mindset, they're able to accept and just believe everything right-wing pundits and propaganda as if it's like the infallible word of God or something.
So what do, I mean, just for listeners that might be tuning in from abroad or just anywhere that want a refresher, what are evangelicals and what do they want and why are they so supportive of Trump?
From my experience, evangelical is kind of another name for the Pentecostal denomination part of Christianity. And for my wife and I, we both grew up in the same church. We actually, before we lived in the New York City area, we were in Iowa. So I'm technically a Midwesterner by blood. But we were raised to be able to die for Jesus and do anything you can to witness and promote the word of God and be a missionary if you can. And so I think just that whole mindset of forcing your mindset and beliefs onto someone else, and then that you're willing to fight and die for that, kind of carried in over to what we saw on January 6th. And everybody, that mindset also is very elitist. It's like, if you're not thinking and believing in God the way I do, you're wrong and you're going to hell. You're inferior. And if you're not going to go my way, then forget you. You're now evil. You're just like, you're either demon possessed or you're just as bad as Satan. But until they get to that point, they're doing everything they can to get you on their side because they want to save you and save your soul and be a big happy family in heaven. It's really messed up thinking. Sorry, I'm probably tangenting a lot.
No, this is fascinating. This has been such a diverse sampling of America in this conversation, and you can't talk about America without talking about evangelicals.
True. Yeah. Unfortunately. But yeah, it's sad because like I see my own brother and my mom go that way. They're all still in Iowa. So yeah, I just try to keep it positive. I try not to go there because then I get upset and then they get upset and then it's just like, well, this was a wasted call. Now we're all upset. So I just try to send them birthday cards and holiday cards and just keep it nice and light. And maybe someday they'll come around, but I don't know. They probably think the same thing of me, to be honest, thinking I'm lost, I'm a wayward boy, and I need to find my way to get right with Jesus and confess and ask for forgiveness, because that's how they think. But yeah, it's not going to happen, unfortunately.
It's estimated that 30% of America is evangelical.
Okay, cool. So the number is shrinking.
What do they see in Trump?
I think, unfortunately, because the Republican Party brands themselves as the Christian Party, that's basically all it takes. So, like, I was talking with my grandma. She's like, I've always voted Republican, and I'm just going to vote for whoever the Republican is because they're who Jesus would vote for. I'm like, well, technically, Jesus wouldn't vote. And he actually probably was even against government. And that's even if he existed. So anyways, she just votes for whoever the Republican is because she believes that is the Christian way to vote. And I think that probably then trickles through a lot of the Republicans. And that's why they vote the way they do.
And so what is next for you? I mean, I know you've gone through a tough time with your wife getting death threats, but how do you plan to keep staying engaged? Are you doing any work now on that? And I know you're also helping people that have been hit hard by the pandemic, as you mentioned, but what's your focus now?
Well, yes, definitely still staying involved. Thankfully, things have settled down. I really had no idea what I would do if the former president ended up getting another term. But thankfully that can relax just a little bit. So you and Sarah did a episode on self-care, so I've just kind of been doing that a little bit. All last year, I didn't even take care of myself, so I gained a bit of weight, so I'm trying to get rid of that. Catching up on some projects that I'm also kind of into music, so I'm trying to get some things done so I can get more publishings of my arrangements and compositions. But as far as being mutually involved in mutual aid around here, we're looking at other ways to be involved safely. Right now, we've kind of found a bunch of people that kind of think the way we do here in Las Vegas. And so if they need help, or we have a friend that was really affected, they were involved in the arts out here. And because pretty much out here, all the shows shut down since last summer. And they're slowly reopening, thankfully, but the governor just got rid of the relief for renters, and they're going to be hit. So we're like, well, why don't we just help pay a couple of their months of rent for them and stuff like that? And so we're just trying to see safer ways that we can be involved and still help those in our community.
So all the stories we've been hearing, whether it's Democrats abroad or the veterans coming together, or a bartender and her customers reaching out and finding supporters, and it's community at the end of the day. Like, it's farmers talking to farmers. And so this has been a story of community and finding community and sticking with our communities. So we want to thank you all for your time today and coming on Gaslit Nation. I needed this conversation as self-care. Sarah and I get bored talking to only each other. And so this was really inspiring for me, and it's going to energize me and all the work that we need to keep doing. And so please stay in touch with us as we move forward and do all this really necessary work, or else it's going to be bad, bad, bad. So thank you all.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate everything you've been doing.
Our discussion continues, and you can get access to that by signing up on our Patreon at the Truth Teller level or higher.
We want to encourage you to donate to your local food bank, which is experiencing a spike in demand. We also encourage you to donate to Oil Change International, an advocacy group supported with a generous donation from the Greta Thunberg Foundation that exposes the true costs of fossil fuels and facilitates the ongoing transition to clean energy.
We also encourage you to donate to the International Rescue Committee, a humanitarian relief organization helping refugees from Afghanistan. Donate at rescue.org. And if you want to help critically endangered orangutans already under pressure from the palm oil industry, donate to the Orangutan Project at theorangutanproject.org. Gaslit Nation is produced by Sarah Kensier and Andrea Chalupa. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us reach more listeners. And check us out on Patreon. It keeps us going. You can also subscribe on YouTube.
Our production managers are Nicholas Torres and Carlin Daigle. Our episodes are edited by Nicholas Torres, and our Patreon exclusive content is edited by Carlin Daigle.
Original music in Gaslit Nation is produced by David Whitehead, Martin Vissenberg, Nick Farr, Damian Arriaga, and Carlin Daigle.
Our logo design was donated to us by Hamish Smith of the New York-based firm Order. Thank you so much, Hamish.
Gaslit Nation would like to thank our supporters at the producer level on Patreon and higher. Jess Sauer,
Chick Quinn,
Lily Wachowski,
Megan McNerney,
Sean Rubin,
Todd S. Perlstein,
Pat,
Kenny Main,
John Schoenthaler,
Frank Jaquette,
Ellen McGirt,
Jill Farren,
Larry Gasson,
Erica Moore,
Karen A. Deal,
Nico Phillips,
Brian E. Castor,
Lex Reed,
Andrea Scalzo,
Melessia Howland,
Karen Heisler,
Jordan Sanders,
Ann Bertino,
T.R. Dunstan,
John Millett, Millet,
David East,
Stu,
Shannon Nacy,
Ida,
Chris Fellow,
Ben Wheaton,
Joseph Mara Jr.,
Rich Holcomb,
Thomas Shiva,
Kelsey Mulsum,
Julie Matthews,
Meganopolis,
Mark,
Barbara Kittredge,
Matthew Womack,
Silas Frank,
Sean Berg,
Kristen Custer,
Tracy Ash,
Benjamin Galuza,
Kai Gillis,
Sharon Hattrick,
Irv Robinson,
William Barry Reeves,
Richard Smith,
Emmy,
Kevin Gannon,
Yvonne Q,
Mike Christensen,
Sandra Kelnans,
Katie Masuris,
John Laughlin,
Jeff Thompson,
James D. Leonard,
Leo Chalupa,
Carol Golstad,
Michael Woldridge,
Kramer No Criming,
Jason Benke,
Joe Darcy,
Ann Marshall,
Jeremy Lewis,
Joel Newman,
Trigve,
Christine M.,
D.L. Singfield,
Matt Perez,
Nicole Spear,
Brian Tajudin,
Maureen Murphy,
Michelle Dash,
Jans Alstrup Rasmussen,
Victoria Olson,
Alabama,
ZW,
Jason Bainbridge,
Sarah Gray,
Mike Tripico,
Diana Gallagher,
John Ripley,
Ethan Mann,
Piet Yitzma,
David Porter,
Kate Cotton,
Kim Mellon,
Leah Campbell,
Lynn Schneider,
Jared Lombardo,
Karen Humphreys,
Eric Kaplan.
Tanya Chalupa.
Thank you all so much for your support of the show. We could not make Gaslit Nation without you.